There are insults you can brush off, and then there are words sharp enough to cut a father's soul to pieces. And on Thanksgiving, my own son carved me deeper than any knife. Thanksgiving has always been a holiday I cherished. Not because of the food or the parades, but because it was one of the few times in my life when family came before everything else. I used to spend weeks planning it when my wife was alive, polishing the good silverware, pulling out the old family recipes, setting the table just so. Back then, the house was warm with laughter and the smell of cinnamon and turkey. But that was years ago. Now, my wife is gone, my body weaker, my independence clipped by a hip surgery that hasn't healed the way I'd hoped. And instead of hosting, I was a guest at my son's house, a guest who'd long overstayed his welcome. Still, I told myself this year would be good. I convinced myself that maybe, over turkey and pumpkin pie, the rift between us would close. I brought a pie from the grocery store, not homemade, but I thought of Emily when I chose it, remembering how my granddaughter Emily used to beg for the pecan pie with extra whipped cream. I even ironed my shirt, though my hands shook. I wanted to look like I belonged at the table. When I arrived, the house was buzzing. My grandkids ran down the hall, their laughter bouncing off the walls. My daughter-in-law rushed between kitchen and dining room, her heels clicking, her face lit with that kind of pride that comes from orchestrating a perfect meal. My son, Mark, stood tall in the kitchen, carving the turkey with exaggerated precision, as though he were performing surgery instead of slicing meat. "Dad, sit down," he said, his voice casual but clipped. "We'll eat in a minute." I smiled, lowering myself into the chair at the far end of the table. I listened as the kids talked about school projects, as my daughter-in-law bragged about her promotion, as my son cracked a joke about the turkey being worth the mortgage. I laughed politely. I wanted to be invisible, not a burden, just part of the noise. But as the meal wore on, the tone shifted. My daughter-in-law gave my son a look across the table. I knew that look. I'd seen it in other marriages, in factory break rooms, in my own mirror once upon a time. It was the look of someone pushing for a decision, silently demanding it be carried out. My son cleared his throat, setting down his fork with deliberate slowness. "Dad," he began, his voice almost too casual. "We've been talking about arrangements." The chatter at the table dimmed. Even the kids seemed to sense something was coming. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He glanced at his wife before continuing. "You've been here a while now. Since the surgery. And well, it's time we all faced reality. You can't just stay here forever. It's not healthy. For anyone." The words landed like stones in my gut. I tried to answer, but my daughter-in-law cut in, her smile tight. "It's not that we don't appreciate you, but the kids need space. We need space. It's not fair to them, or to us, to keep rearranging our lives indefinitely." I looked at my son, searching for the boy I raised, the boy I carried on my shoulders at ball games, the boy I worked overtime for so he could have new sneakers every school year. But the man sitting across from me wasn't that boy anymore. He was someone colder. And then he said it. "You're a Leech. We don't want you living with us." The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. For a moment the world seemed to tilt. The kids stared, their eyes wide. My daughter-in-law smirked, sipping her wine as if satisfied. And my son, my own flesh and blood, looked at me like I was a parasite sucking the life out of his perfect home. I wanted to shout. To remind him of the nights I worked double shifts so he could go to college. To remind him of the car I bought him with money I didn't have. To remind him that when his mother died, I was the one who held him while he cried, promising him he'd never be alone. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood slowly, my legs trembling. My pride was all I had left, and I clung to it with both hands. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of wood against tile loud in the silence. "I see," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. I pulled on my coat, heavy with the weight of rejection, and stepped out into the cold November night. The air bit at my face, sharp with the promise of snow. Behind me, laughter resumed, forced, hollow, but laughter all the same. I walked down the street, the pie box still under my arm, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly unwanted. Humiliation doesn't come with fists or bruises, it comes with words that echo in the silence after the door shuts behind you. The November air slapped me the second I stepped outside, sharp enough to sting my lungs. The neighborhood was quiet except for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the faint sound of laughter still drifting from my son's house. My house once, in a way, I'd helped him with the down payment years ago, back when his credit was a mess and his future shaky. I'd told myself it was an investment in family, that one day he'd remember who stood in his corner. But as I walked down that dark street, pie box tucked under my arm like a shield, all I felt was the weight of betrayal. Leech. The word dug in deeper than any insult I'd ever heard. I'd been called plenty in my life, stubborn, hard-headed, even mean in my younger years. But never that. Not from my own blood. Every step I took, the memories hit harder. I remembered the time I worked triple shifts at the plant just to buy him his first baseball glove, the good leather one, not the cheap knockoff. I remembered patching up his knees when he fell off his bike, telling him to be tough, to get back on. I remembered his first car, a rusted Chevy I bought off a buddy for $800. I spent weekends under that hood, fixing it piece by piece until it ran smooth enough for him to drive to college. And college, I remembered those loans I co-signed, the money I scraped together. I ate beans on toast more nights than I can count just so his tuition checks cleared. He never asked where the money came from. He never asked if I was eating. He just took the keys, took the money, took the sacrifices, and ran with them. And now? I was a leech. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to mock me. My hip ached, each step sending a dull throb through my side. I should have been resting, healing, not trudging through the cold like some vagrant. But the warmth of that house wasn't mine anymore. It never really had been, I realized. By the time I reached Main Street, my breath puffing clouds into the air, I spotted a small diner still open. The neon sign flickered, half the letters dead, but the smell of coffee and fried onions drifted out when I pushed the door. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A couple sat in a booth near the window, speaking low. A trucker nursed a mug at the counter, his cap pulled low. I slid into a booth at the far end, setting the pie box down like it mattered, like it gave me an anchor. The waitress came over, tired-eyed but kind. "Coffee?" "Yeah," I said, my voice rough. When she left, I sat there with my hands folded, staring at the pie. Store-bought, neat, untouched. I'd brought it to share, thinking it might soften the edges, remind my son of childhood Thanksgivings when his mother was alive, when we were whole. Instead, it sat here, a symbol of how out of place I was in his world now. The words replayed in my head, each time sharper, "You're a leech. We don't want you living with us." I thought about what it meant to be unwanted. I thought about men I'd known who grew old and found themselves shoved aside, forgotten in nursing homes, their voices ignored. Was that to be my fate? To be cast out, discarded like old furniture? Anger swelled in me, pushing back against the despair. I wasn't a leech. I was the reason he had that house, that family, that life. And I'd be damned if my story ended with me shivering in some diner, while he carved turkey in comfort. Revenge doesn't arrive all at once. It starts as a whisper, a thought you don't even admit to yourself. Mine came as I stirred sugar into my coffee, watching the crystals dissolve. They think I'm weak. They think I've got nothing left. But they're wrong. I didn't know how yet. But I knew this much: I wasn't going to fade quietly. I picked up the pie box, slid a slice onto the plate the waitress brought, and forced myself to eat. Each bite was heavy, but it gave me strength. Thanksgiving wasn't about gratitude anymore. For me, it had become a declaration. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Humiliation can break you, or it can teach you one thing: that the quietest man in the room can be the most dangerous if he chooses to move. I walked out of that diner with Thanksgiving still clinging to my jacket like a bad smell. The street lamps smeared halos over puddles. My breath came out in white puffs that tasted like old sorrow. I could have gone home and let the night swallow me. Instead, I drove to the only place that still felt like mine in some practical, stubborn way, the public library. There are fewer witnesses there, more rows of facts and records, and in my head facts felt like armor. The plan, if you can call it that in the beginning, was small, cautious, almost cowardly. It had to be. I'm no longer a young man who can charge the castle with a rifle and a chip on his shoulder. I have to use leverage of a different kind, patience, memory, and the little favors a lifetime of being useful buys you. First thing Monday I called Frank, not for muscle but for eyes. Frank's a friend who still drives the streets of our town like it's his map, who knows the bus routes, who can tell you which neighbor's kid works where. I asked him to keep an ear out, to notice if my son's car was out late, to listen for contractors at odd hours. I didn't tell him everything, I didn't have to. He knows me. He knows I have reasons. Then I started to look like an old man might, shuffling paper, making careful lists. I dug out ledgers from a long box in the garage that smelled faintly of oil and mildew. Receipts, canceled checks, the old bill from the down payment I'd helped with years ago, they were relics, but they were my relics. I ran my finger along the faded ink and remembered the nights I skipped dinner so his tuition cleared. The memory steeled me. Next, I did something that felt like trespassing but wasn't. I started paying attention. Real paying attention. I walked past my son's house with purpose, not in the dead of night but in the daylight, casual as a man buying a paper. I watched where he parked, what time his truck left, whether his wife's car had dents from too many grocery runs. I stood across the street once and let the afternoon sun heat my face while I watched their routine like a play I'd seen 100 times in rehearsal. Children off to school, a neighbor dropping off something, laughter through an open window. Ordinary. Safe. That's what they wanted the world to look like. But ordinary breaks, and when it does, it reveals seams. I found a seam in small things. An online neighborhood group where locals complained about a contractor who'd done poor work 2 houses down, and in the comments, my daughter-in-law's name popped up, defending the guy. She had posted once, with a few emojis, from an account with a recipe for avocado toast as its bio. That told me 2 things: she had public persona concerns, and she was not as careful about digital footprints as she thought. The internet is a museum of mistakes, and I began to catalog hers. I visited the county clerk's office the next day. The seats were worn, the fluorescent lights hummed, and the woman at the counter remembered me from years of bureaucratic tedium. I asked for public records, permits filed for renovations at my son's address, the name of the contractor, liens if any. I paid the small fee and waited. There they were, a permit for kitchen modifications, filed 6 months ago, the contractor's company name, an email address. No lien. But the permit had a start date that matched my son's brag about finally finishing the new countertop. Little threads, I told myself. Little threads that might lead to larger knots. At night I spoke to a man named Lewis at the bar where I once worked a double shift decades ago. Lewis is a practical man. He knows bookkeeping and he knows where to find it. I asked carefully if he'd been paid by my son's contractor in cash or check. He said he'd heard through the grapevine the contractor liked to do cash deals to avoid the paperwork when the owner wanted to make the job look cheaper to the bank. Cash leaves no trail, and that worried me. If you want to hide the money you've spent on improvements to an asset so you can pretend you don't have it later, cash is the favorite currency. This was when I started to talk to the bank, not to yell or demand, but to ask gentle, hypothetical questions. If a man wanted to protect his assets, what would he do? I'd ask. The woman on the other end of the phone, whose name I would memorize because small details become useful, would tell me about trusts and joint accounts and power of attorney. I scribbled the words down like a man learning a new trade. I did not look for lawyers to shame my son or for ways to evict him. I looked for containment. If they were planning to push me out entirely, I would not give them the satisfaction of a hurried line through my signature. I opened a safe deposit box at a small bank where they still knew my name. The clerk was polite and efficient. I put in there the documents that mattered, the deed copy, a note of the payments I'd made early on, copies of account statements. It felt oddly intimate to slide the box shut and lock it with a key that would live in my pocket. A key is a small, honest weapon. All the while, I kept the face, the tired old man, the grateful guest. At the house I pretended to nap more easily than I actually did, let my son think his burden had been me. When he complained about extra utility costs in front of his wife, I nodded, apologetic, and asked him what chores I could do around the house. It was theater, but theater that kept them comfortable and unwatched while I mapped the perimeter of their life. Then I began the slow work of testing. I mentioned casually, in a voice meant to sound like gratitude, that I'd been thinking of downsizing some things. Just to make life easier for you too. My son's face changed, microseconds of surprise, then the practiced smile of someone who smelled an opportunity. "That'd be great, Dad," he said. "We could help you find something small and affordable." Good. That reaction told me wolves smell blood. It also told me what their instinct was: immediate convenience. They wanted me to be easy. Sometimes revenge is simple arithmetic: pressure in one place, release in another. I tightened the screws where they would feel the pinch. I sent a polite email, formal and unassuming, to the contractor named on the permit, asking for a copy of their liability insurance. Nothing accusatory, only a suggestion that someone should confirm coverage before work began. The reply came back bland. "We're covered." But the name on the policy was a small company with a P.O. box, not a business address. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing, not yet, but it was another thread to pull. In the evenings I revisited the ledger entries. I wrote down every favor I'd paid, every odd loan I'd extended without mention. Old friends called back. One lent me names of a financial advisor who'd help mend my age-arranged protections. Another offered to sit in on a conversation under the guise of a neighborly visit. No promises of violence, no threats, just a network of people who remembered me as a man who helped them when they were down. Favors rack up like interest over decades, and now I plan to collect. There were nights I almost gave in to bitterness, the sort that ticks a man off the edge into something ugly. I resisted not because I loved them less but because I loved the life I'd built with them more. I wanted the right kind of reckoning, one that stung, that taught, but didn't cross the line into the lawless. I wanted them to see the consequences of their choice and to remember who they'd been taught by. I wanted restitution of dignity, not a headline in the paper. By the end of the week, I had a file thicker than when I'd started. Receipts, permit copies, names, a little map of digital breadcrumbs. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't dramatic. It was work. But I'd learned in my life that work often wins where emotion fails. On Sunday night I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold and looked at what I'd gathered. The house hummed around me, warm and oblivious. Outside, a single leaf skittered across the driveway like a small, solitary thing running from a storm. I folded my hands on the papers, feeling the faint ache in my hip but a steady resolve in my chest. I'd walked out of Thanksgiving with my pockets empty and my heart bruised. I'd come back with something else: patience, proof, and a list of small, merciless levers I could pull. They'd called me a leech. They didn't know the lesson I'd learned in that night on the sidewalk, that a man with little left to lose can be very careful in how he takes back what's his. Tomorrow I would test the first one. You don't always win a war with a single strike. Sometimes it's the thousand small pulls that unravel a life. I started with one tiny tug, and waited to see which thread came loose. I woke early that Monday with the taste of last night's coffee gone cold in my mouth and a single thought humming: start small. Big gestures belong to younger men and courtroom dramas. I wanted something slower, more precise, a set of calibrated inconveniences that would make my son and his wife feel the steady, eroding pressure of consequences without giving them a martyr's rally cry. Humiliation without spectacle. Awareness without violence. That was the sort of revenge that fit an old man with creaky knees and a ledger of favors behind him. My first move was practical and, to anyone watching, almost harmless: a call to the town inspector's office. I'd learned, over years of repairs and permits, that the system moves like a sleepy river, slow but relentless. If you put a stone in its path, the ripple shows up where you want it. I asked the woman at the counter, Mrs. Delgado, questions in a tone that was casual but precise. I was wondering about a permit filed for 24 Birch Lane, the kitchen remodel. I'm curious if they pulled the right permits, or if the electrical subcontractor is listed. She typed slowly and then, with the weary professionalism of someone used to angry homeowners, told me the job was permitted but the documentation had a minor discrepancy, an email address for the subcontractor that bounced. Probably a typo, she said. But I'll flag it for the inspector to double-check. It's routine. Routine, but a flagged permit means an inspector shows up, and an inspector means delays and questions. I could already see the way my daughter-in-law would mouth a curse and my son would mutter about contractors who don't know what they're doing. I pictured the polite knock on their door from a man in a neon vest holding a clipboard. That image warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. From the inspector's office, I walked across town to a small coffee shop where the contractor's name, the one listed on the permit, had a bulletin board flyer tacked up among the community notices. I ordered coffee and sat where I could watch the door. A man came in, glanced at the flyer, and then at me, perhaps noting the curiosity of an old man with a notepad. I scribbled that contractor's company number, and the P.O. box listed on their business card. I made a mental note: cash deals. Small companies, big promises. The sort of businesses that skated on the edge of paperwork and reputation. The next move was to call the contractor. I used a careful voice, friendly and foolish sounding. Hello? I'm calling from a neighbor's home on Birch Lane. We're just checking who's responsible for the remodel. We want to make sure our properties aren't affected. A man answered, eager, brisk. He named off a crew, an estimated finish date. He minimized complications, the practiced patter of a man who sells assurance the way other men sell cars. I asked casual follow-ups: insurance? Subcontractors? His answer slid around my questions like oil. No proof, no references, but plenty of charm. I thanked him and hung up with a little file in my head: shaky, plausible denial. Perfect. Back at home I made another call, this one to a friend who ran a small local accounting firm. I didn't ask for a raid or for my son to be audited. I asked a question that sounded harmless. If someone wanted to transfer ownership of a property quietly, what's the typical paperwork? He gave me an overview of title searches, of how joint ownership works, and of how quickly a shovey signature can become legal bedrock. I listened, asked more questions, and then said casually, "Thanks. I might have a client who needs it." He didn't press. Men like him owe me favors from a long winter when I lent a hand and a check. Calls accumulate interest. Next, I took the behavior of observation up a notch. For 2 days I did old man errands with fresh intent, groceries at noon, time when contractors often leave, dropping off a book at the library, watering the small plant at the corner bodega. But in the pockets of these errands I pried for little things: which cars were in the driveway at specific times, whether a particular man showed up with a folding ladder and stayed 2 hours or 10, whether my son's truck had a strange new dent. Each small detail was a pixel. Together, they'd form a picture I could use. I also began to seed whispers in places that mattered. Not lies, but inconvenient truths. A neighbor who'd once borrowed my lawnmower took my call and agreed, quietly, to mention that the contractor's workers had left paint streaks on his mailbox last week. The Homeowners Association, an organization of gossip and good suits, received a polite email from me pointing out that the kitchen remodel seemed to be spilling over into exterior landscaping without prior notice. It's remarkable what a well-placed question does. People start to look, and once they do, small problems get noticed and magnified. My son noticed sooner than I expected. It was a Friday morning when he called, voice clipped and irritated. Dad, what did you do? Inspector just came by, said something about a flag permit. You telling people about our remodel? He sounded frightened in a way he rarely let anyone hear. Fear is a weaker colored emotion than pride, but it's visible on the same canvas, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I heard vulnerability in him. I kept my voice warm and oblivious. Oh, did he? Maybe just a routine check. You know how the town is. I just happened to ask a question while I was at the counter, that's all. I let the phrase hang, casual as a shrug. You'll get it sorted. I could hear him run his hand through his hair. Right. Okay, Dad. Thanks. The call ended with a click, and I sat for a moment with a quiet grin that felt like sunlight on old bones. In the days that followed, the smart little disruptions accumulated. A polite letter to the HOA about possible unpermitted work grew into a neighborly complaint when the same truck kept parking in the no parking zone. The inspector returned and requested to see insurance documents. The contractor scuffled to provide them. Weeks of promised finish dates stretched as glue, and drywall delivery schedules slipped. My son came to my porch once, late, whiskey breath and apology in his eyes. He spoke low. Dad, this is getting expensive. The pause is costing us. I took his hand, an old reflex of tenderness mixing with the cold calculus of strategy. I'm sorry, son. That's unfortunate. His look was sharp, a mix of blame and bargaining. We'll pay for it, he said. We'll cover the costs. He meant whatever it took to keep the project moving. He meant silence. It's important to be careful in these things. I didn't want to ruin lives. I wanted to remind them of the scaffolding their comfort stood on. I wanted them to taste insecurity for a while, to understand that the house and the heat and the convenience were not entitlements, but results of hands that had worked and bled. So when he offered to cover the costs, I let him. I accepted but asked for something small in return, an open conversation about living arrangements, to be scheduled with a witness. He agreed, too quickly. Greed for peace is often the door that hides the trap. While the contractor scrambled, I moved the other pieces into place quietly. I visited the bank and ensured my safe deposit records were complete. I whispered to Elaine, my lawyer, about a contingency plan if they pushed me out. We'll draft a memorandum of intent, she said in her brisk, efficient voice. Nothing dramatic. Just a paper trail that shows your ownership and the contributions you've made. If they try to leverage you, we'll have evidence. Evidence had always been my comfort. Showing up with a small, neat stack of paperwork felt as good as any counterpunch. There were moments of conscience, too. The line between teaching a lesson and being cruel is thin, and I didn't want to cross it. When the contractor's teenage son lost his job because the project stalled, I felt it like a sharp splinter. I called Frank and asked him to offer that boy a few hours at the garage, fix up an old bike to get him some spending money. Paybacks that didn't punish by proxy were important. I wanted culpability felt, not innocent suffering. By the time Thanksgiving rolled into winter, cracks were showing. My daughter-in-law snapped at a delivery man who couldn't accommodate a sudden request. My son, once facile and certain, began tucking his lip between his teeth before he spoke. He started leaving later for work and returning later, a man fraying at the edges. People at the neighborhood store began to look at him with sympathetic distance, and when a mutual acquaintance let slip that the inspector was back on the birch job, my son's face paled with the kind of fear men who feel they're sliding into debt know well. The first pull had done what I wanted. It had shifted the center of gravity in their life. They were no longer comfortably insulated. That shift did not feel like triumph. It felt like balance beginning to tilt back to where it ought to have been. I stood in the quiet of my kitchen one evening, the lamp casting a small cone of light over the papers on my table, and felt something like a tired satisfaction. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't broken a window. I just turned on the slow tap of consequence and let time leak. There was a final, tender moment before the next phase. My son stopped by one afternoon, hands in his pockets, eyes reddened. Dad, he said, softer than I'd ever heard. We're sorry. Maybe we were harsh. Can we talk? There was something in his voice, not contrition entirely, but the beginning of it. I looked at him, at the man who had once been the boy I'd tucked into bed, and felt a father's fatigue fold into something gentler than vengeance. For the record, I said slowly, I don't want to feed pride with punishment. I want a place in this family that isn't a burden. If we're going to make changes, let's make them together, with fairness. I watched his chest rise and fall. He nodded, but I could see the worry still gnawing at him. We agreed to talk in a week, with a friend present. It was small. It was bureaucratic. It was the beginning of a conversation rather than a surrender. But it was also the exact kind of fissure that returns dignity, not a dramatic courtroom victory, but the slow reckoning of adults who discover comfort is not a right, it's an earned chapter in a life you share. As I closed the door after he left, I recognized the truth: revenge isn't always about the rupture. Sometimes it's about the repair. I had pulled a thread, watched the fabric shift, and made sure the result would let me sit at the table without being eaten alive. The slow work of justice had begun, and I was ready for the next pull. Revenge doesn't always roar in with fireworks. Sometimes it's the soft groan of wood under strain, the sound of cracks spreading where no one's looking. The week after my son's visit, I noticed how his tone shifted. The sharpness was dulled, replaced with unease. He avoided long conversations, and when he did stop by, he lingered like a man who had questions he couldn't quite bring himself to ask. That was fine by me. Silence is fertile ground for strategy. The kitchen remodel dragged on. Neighbors whispered about the constant hammering and half-finished work. The inspector had been back twice now, asking for more paperwork. Each time, my son looked more frayed. He stopped bragging to neighbors about his dream kitchen and started apologizing for the noise. His wife wasn't as graceful. I overheard her snapping at one of the contractors in the driveway, her voice carrying even through my closed window. We're paying good money for this, and it's still not finished? The man muttered something about permits and insurance and drove off. I knew what that meant: costs were mounting. Contractors don't like to linger on jobs that might bite them legally. They add fees. They drag their heels. They pressure. And my son, who once called me a leech, was now bleeding money into a pit he couldn't fill fast enough. I didn't need to strike again immediately. Patience was my ally. Instead, I watched. I kept notes. I marked the dates of every truck that came and went. I even struck up casual conversations with neighbors, the kind where you say, "Funny, all this work and still no finished product, huh?" A raised eyebrow here, a knowing chuckle there. Seeds. The pie I'd carried that Thanksgiving night was still in my fridge, now stale, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. It sat there like a reminder, a symbol of what I'd carried out into the cold when they cast me aside. Sometimes I'd open the fridge just to look at it, and I'd remember that word, Leech. Every plan, every slow turn of the screw, was fed by that memory. One afternoon, I stopped by the bank again. I wanted to double-check my safe deposit contents. The manager greeted me by name, polite but curious. I told her I liked to keep my affairs in order, that I was getting older and cautious. She smiled, but I saw her glance at the stack of documents I slid into the box. Copies of my contributions. Notes on the house. Everything that proved I wasn't some parasite living off my son's charity. I was a foundation stone in that family's life, and I wanted the paper to prove it if I needed to. That night, I called Elaine again. She was direct, as always. "Paul," she said, "you need to decide what outcome you actually want. Do you want to teach them a lesson, or do you want to strip them bare? Because those are two very different paths." I sat with that question long after the call ended. At first, the fury in me wanted to say strip them bare. Take everything. Make them crawl. But another part of me, the father still hidden under layers of betrayal, didn't want annihilation. I wanted recognition. I wanted them to understand the gravity of what they'd done, to feel the weight of the word they'd thrown at me, and to come back humbled. The cracks widened without me lifting another finger. my son's wife started parking her car 2 houses down, as if avoiding confrontation. My son came home later, shoulders heavy, his confidence worn thin. And I, the so-called Leech, sat quietly at my table, drinking my tea, reading my old ledgers, and planning my next move. I didn't need to hurry. Time itself was working for me. It's one thing to watch cracks form, another to slip a wedge inside and twist, just enough so the whole structure groans under its own weight. By December, the house at Birch Lane had lost its sheen. The dream remodel was now a running joke in the neighborhood. Where once my son puffed his chest and bragged about quartz counters and modern lighting, he now scowled at half-installed cabinets and wires dangling like vines from the ceiling. The laughter I used to hear spilling from their windows was quieter, sharper, like knives clinking instead of glasses. I didn't strike recklessly. A younger man might have slammed doors or thrown fists. But at 59, I'd learned the best kind of revenge is patient, deliberate, and precise. I chose moments the way a carpenter chooses nails, carefully, where they'd hold longest. The first screw I turned was financial. I mailed a polite, anonymous note to the HOA, attaching a photocopy of the flag permit for the Harris home at 24 Birch Lane. Concerned about safety issues in the neighborhood, I wrote. No accusation, no dramatic claims, just a neighbor worried about property values. The kind of letter HOA boards eat like candy. Within a week, my son had received a formal notice, reminding him that all exterior work must comply with regulations and be completed within a reasonable time frame. He ranted about nosy neighbors at dinner one night, his voice carrying through the thin winter air. I sipped my tea in silence, the corner of my mouth twitching. The second screw was social. I'd kept my notes about the contractor's slipshod habits, and at the local diner, I made sure to mention them in the right ears. Heard the Birch job's been stalled for weeks, I said casually. Insurance might not even be in order. Word travels fast in small towns. Soon enough, my son's wife couldn't go to the grocery store without overhearing someone muttering about how those renovations are never going to end. Pride is fragile, and theirs was being chipped away piece by piece. The third screw was personal. One evening, when my son dropped by with his youngest to leave me some groceries, his attempt at peace, or guilt, maybe both, I made sure to look tired, smaller than usual. I thanked him softly, with just enough crack in my voice to plant unease. I appreciate this, I told him. After everything, it means something. His eyes flickered, caught between guilt and frustration. I didn't need to say more. Silence did the work. But perhaps the most effective wedge was patience. I didn't call them. I didn't ask for favors. I stayed quiet, self-sufficient. And in that quiet, they started to stew. My daughter-in-law, used to painting me as a burden, suddenly had nothing to point to. No mess, no neediness, no noise. Just me, the man they'd labeled a leech, living quietly, with dignity they couldn't tarnish. The contrast made their cruelty look sharper, even to themselves. Still, I wasn't done. I began preparing the next move, paperwork. Elaine had drafted a clean, sharp memorandum documenting every cent I'd invested in that house. Down payments, repair costs, even the small monthly contributions I'd made when times were hard. All signed, notarized, sealed. You keep this safe, she told me. If they ever try to push you legally, you'll have the hammer, not them. I tucked the documents into my deposit box, running my fingers over the envelope before closing the drawer. It wasn't just paper. It was proof. Proof that I wasn't what they called me. Proof that I had always given more than I took. By the time Christmas lights went up, the house on Birch Lane was no longer a home glowing with pride, it was a pressure cooker. And I was the one adjusting the flame, higher and higher, waiting for the whistle. Because I knew this, humiliation festers. And sooner or later they'd break. Every dam has a weak spot. You don't need to smash it with a hammer, just keep pressing the same point until the water bursts through. By the second week of January, winter had settled heavy over the neighborhood. Snow piled in the gutters, I sheathed the driveways, and everything seemed quieter, muffled. Everything except Birch Lane. From where I sat on my porch, I could hear the muffled shouts from inside my son's house more often than I cared to admit. Their voices, sharp and bitter, slicing through the cold air like cracks in the ice. The remodel had stalled completely. The contractor had stopped showing up. The inspector had sent yet another notice demanding clarification on insurance paperwork. And the HOA had scheduled a compliance review that was set for the following month. It was a trifecta of frustration, and all of it bore down directly on my son and his wife. I didn't have to wonder how they were handling it, I could see it. My daughter-in-law carried herself with the brittle sharpness of a woman on the edge. Her face tightened every time she caught a neighbor looking. She snapped at the children in the driveway, her voice carrying in shrill bursts. My son, on the other hand, looked worn down. His shoulders sagged, his words slowed, and he no longer strutted when he left for work. He looked, for the first time in years, like a man being eaten alive by his own choices. I didn't press. I didn't gloat. I let the weight sit. But I was patient enough to wait for the crack that always comes. It arrived one Thursday night. I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of weak tea when there was a knock at my door. Not the casual knock of a neighbor, not the cheerful tap of grandkids. A hard, urgent knock. When I opened it, there stood my son, his face pale, his eyes red as though he hadn't slept in days. "Dad," he said, his voice low and raw. I need help." There it was. The moment I'd been waiting for. I stepped aside, motioning him in. He hesitated, like pride was a chain wrapped tight around his chest. But then he walked past me, sat at my table, and dropped his head into his hands. "They're threatening fines," he said. "The contractor says he won't come back unless I pay more up front. The inspector's talking about violations. I don't know what to do." He rubbed his temples, his voice breaking. "And Lisa, she blames me. Says I should have handled it better. She says it's all falling apart because of me." I studied him quietly. This was the same man who, less than 2 months ago, had looked me in the eye over Thanksgiving dinner and called me a leech. Now here he was, broken, asking for the very support he'd spat on. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him of those words, to grind them into his ears until he felt every ounce of shame I'd carried. But the wiser part of me knew that silence was sharper. So I let the pause hang in the air until he finally looked up at me. "Dad, please. I need your advice. He stopped, swallowing. "I need you." That was the crack. The dam breaking. I leaned back slowly, letting the chair creak under me. "Funny," I said softly. "I thought you didn't want me living with you. I thought I was a burden. A leech." His face crumpled. Shame painted itself across his features, raw and undeniable. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just bowed his head again, his shoulders sagging further. "Dad," he whispered. "I was wrong." The words settled in the room like the snow outside, slow, heavy, impossible to ignore. For the first time since that night on Thanksgiving, I felt a flicker of something close to satisfaction. This wasn't the end, not yet. But the balance had shifted. And now, it was time to decide just how far I wanted this lesson to go. When a man who once called you a leech sits at your table begging for help, you don't rush. You make him wait, and in the waiting, he learns what power really feels like. My son sat across from me, hollowed out by shame. His hands clenched and unclenched against the table as though he didn't know what to do with them. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, not in years, but in wear. Pride had kept him tall for decades. Now it had bent him low. I let the silence stretch until it was taut as a rope. The old me would have filled it with reassurance, with fatherly comfort. But this new chapter required patience. Every second of silence pressed deeper into his conscience. Finally, I folded my hands on the table. "So," I said evenly, "you need help." He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "And what do you think I can do for you?" He swallowed hard. Advice. Maybe money. I don't know how to fix this, Dad. His voice cracked. I can't lose the house. Not in front of the kids. Not after everything. I studied him, remembering the boy who used to run through the yard with scraped knees, yelling for me to watch him climb higher, run faster. That boy had grown into a man who thought he was above me, who thought he could toss me aside like worn-out boots. And now he was here, brought back low. I'll help, I said finally. Relief washed over his face, quick as spring sunlight. But I wasn't finished. On conditions. His head snapped up. Conditions? Yes, I said. My voice was steady, calm. Because the last time I relied on your word, I was humiliated in front of my family on Thanksgiving. I won't let that happen again. He shifted in his chair, shame tightening his shoulders. What conditions? I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his. First, you'll put in writing that I am not a guest in your home. I am a stakeholder in it. My contributions, down payments, repairs, utilities, will be documented. Elaine, my lawyer, will draft the paperwork. You'll sign it. Your wife will sign it. His jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. Second, I continued, you will never again call me a burden in front of your children. You will make sure they understand the truth, that I built the foundation you stand on. If they hear whispers otherwise, you'll correct them immediately. Do you understand? He nodded slowly, his throat tight. And third, I let the pause sting before finishing. Respect. No more dismissive words. No more contempt. I may be old, but I am not finished. You will show me the dignity I've earned. The words hung heavy between us. My son's face flushed, pride wrestling with desperation. But desperation always wins in the end. All right, he whispered. I'll agree. I let out a slow breath, not triumphant but steady, like a man closing a deal he knew would stand. Good. Because without those terms, you'll sink in this mess, and I won't lift a finger. His shoulders slumped, defeat mixing with reluctant relief. For the first time, he understood. The man he'd called a leech was the same man holding the rope that could pull him out of the pit. When he left that night, the snow crunching under his boots, I sat in the quiet kitchen and stared at the pie still sitting in my fridge. Stale, untouched, but still there, just like me. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt full. Promises made at a kitchen table can vanish with the morning sun, but when they're written in black ink, notarized and filed, they become chains no pride can break. The following week, I called Elaine. She didn't sound surprised when I told her what I wanted. I had a feeling this day was coming, she said, the faintest edge of satisfaction in her tone. Send him to my office. Bring his wife. We'll make it official. When I told my son, he hesitated. His face twitched the way it used to when he was caught in a lie as a boy. Dad, Lisa isn't going to like this. I looked at him steadily. She doesn't have to like it. She just has to sign it. He dropped his gaze and nodded. Pride was still gnawing at him, but desperation had its teeth in deeper. On Thursday afternoon, the three of us sat in Elaine's office. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Certificates framed the walls, her desk polished to a shine that reflected their uneasy faces. Elaine greeted them like a schoolteacher welcoming children who'd misbehaved. She slid the papers across the desk. This document acknowledges that Mr. Harris contributed to the initial down payment of the home at 24 Birch Lane, as well as subsequent repairs and household costs. It affirms his right to permanent residency unless he chooses otherwise, and establishes his financial stake. Both parties' signatures are required. Lisa's lips tightened into a thin line. This is ridiculous, she said. We're not. Elaine cut her off with professional calm. Mrs. Harris, this isn't about your feelings. It's about legal protection. If you disagree, you're welcome to refuse. But understand this, without his consent, your property record could be contested. Courts don't look kindly on situations where financial contributors are discarded. Lisa's face flushed red, but she said nothing. My son shifted uncomfortably beside her, his jaw working. He glanced at me, searching for compromise, maybe mercy. I offered none. Sign it, I said, my voice steady. For a long moment, silence hung in the air. Then, with a sharp exhale, my son reached for the pen. The scratch of ink against paper sounded like a verdict being read. Lisa followed, her signature quick and angry, like she was carving her frustration into the page. Elaine stamped the document, slid copies into folders, and handed one to me. Congratulations, Mr. Harris, she said. Your rights are protected. I took the folder, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It wasn't just paper, it was dignity, restored and preserved. As we left the office, Lisa stormed ahead, her heels clicking like gunshots on the tile. My son lingered behind. Dad, he murmured, I know this doesn't fix everything. But thank you for helping us. I looked at him, my son, the man who had once called me a leech. He didn't realize that by signing those papers, he had admitted the truth, that I had never been a burden. That I had always been the backbone. I didn't reply. I just walked out into the cold air, the folder tucked under my arm. That night, I placed the signed copy into my safe deposit box. When the drawer slid shut, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anger, richer than revenge. Because now, no matter what they said, no matter how they tried to pain me, the truth was written in ink, permanent, undeniable. And I knew it was only a matter of time before that truth would reshape everything in their home. Revenge that lasts isn't a shout, it's the slow rearrangement of someone's world so that every day reminds them who they crossed. I didn't want them ruined. I wanted them to remember. The last piece of the plan was quiet and ordinary, the sort of thing people miss because they expect fireworks and not the simple click of locks and the paperwork that follows. After the signatures were filed and the folder rested in the bank's safe, I spent a week doing what elderly men do best, making small, deliberate changes that felt neither dramatic nor cruel, and yet added up to a life my son couldn't pretend hadn't been built by my hands. First, I made sure they knew I'd taken my responsibility seriously. I sent an email, matter of fact, not triumphant, to the contractor on record, copying the county inspector and the HOA. In it I asked for receipts of recent payments, details of subcontractors, and proof of insurance. It read like a neighbor's inquiry. No thunderbolts. But folks who run remodeling shows and contractors who prefer cash don't like records. The request triggered a cascade: follow-up forms, insurance paperwork, a demand for proof that the crew was licensed. The contractor grumbled in the neighborhood diner and called my son twice more than he'd wanted to. Those calls rang in my house like small bells, reminders that attention existed now where it hadn't 6 weeks earlier. Next, I called our utility company, not to be petty, but to update account notes. I asked that any major service changes or requests for additional lines, meters, or work be routed through me as well. That way, if plans changed at Birch Lane, there'd be an administrative hitch. Red tape slows people down and invites accountability. My son complained when he learned. Dad, why are you doing that? He sounded small and tired. I told him plainly. Because the house is partly mine now. I want to know what happens to it. It shut him up. Then I started fulfilling the second, softer part of the revenge, repair of memory and reputation. I called the grandkids' school and volunteered for a read-aloud day and for help with a future class field trip. I wrote a letter to a small local charity where I'd volunteered decades ago, offering a modest donation under the family name, not to buy favor, but to remind the neighborhood of the man who'd always paid his dues. These actions were visible to neighbors, me in the school library, laughing with the kids as I butchered the voices in a picture book, me at the community center, clearing out old tools for a neighborhood workshop. People started to remember. Small, civilized public acts have a way of eroding gossip. My son noticed the change not as a sudden humiliation but as the steady pressure of daylight on mildew. He called less in panic and more in negotiation. Dad, we need to talk about the payments, he said one evening. We can set up a monthly reimbursement plan. I don't want any more surprises for the kids. I agreed on my terms. We scheduled a sit-down where we would go over household budgets in plain sight, with numbers on a table, no sour words. He squinted at spreadsheets and receipts, and in that squint I saw understanding dawning. The life he'd taken for granted came at a cost someone else had borne. The most important move was one I never told him I'd make. I sat with my lawyer and drafted a clear addendum to the agreement, a care and access clause that guaranteed my place at the house as a resident, but also created a structure for mutual respect. It required a monthly family meeting, a simple, dignified thing where we discussed bills, chores, and kids' activities. It sounded bureaucratic, because it was. In practice, it forced conversation in the open and made hiding contempt difficult. Secret contempt needs shadow to survive, daylight kills it. When Elaine explained it, she called it an institutionalized civility. I called it a way to sit at dinner without a blade in my back. When the documents were delivered to their mailbox, the response was not immediate fury. Instead, there were small, human adjustments. My son stopped snapping when he walked in. My daughter-in-law tried a softer tone that sometimes slid and then corrected itself. The kids learned to ask me about my week rather than plop a tablet in front of me as if I were a vessel for babysitting alone. They began to see me the way I'd always been, not a burden to be moved, but a person still full of days and stories. There were humiliations left to address, of course. I didn't let the phrase Leech float unchallenged. When my grandson, 9 and confused, asked what a leech was after hearing other kids repeat the word, I sat with him on the porch and told stories about the hard work it takes to build something for someone else. I told him how people we love sometimes make mistakes, and how language can hurt. He listened, then asked if I could teach him to fix a bike tire. I did. Teaching is a better revenge than punishment. It transfers what was taken and rebuilds. The contractor was eventually fined for failing to show proper insurance documentation. The county slapped a penalty, and the contractor's company went quiet. It wasn't spectacular, but it solved the problem and closed a dangerous loophole. My son paid for the remainder of the stalled work out of contract and with my oversight, not because I demanded dollars, but because the neighborhood had become a little inconvenient for those who hid truths behind friendly smiles. One evening, months after that first bitter Thanksgiving, my son sat across from me at the kitchen table. His weathered face had lines of humility now etched into it. "Dad," he said, looking me right in the eyes for the first time in a long while, "I was a real bastard. You were right about a lot of things. I'm sorry." His voice wasn't theatrical. It was small, sincere, and cracked in the places where pride gives way. He took my hand across the table. I felt his grip, quick and warm, and answered simply, "I never wanted you ruined. Just remembered." There was no cinematic moment of triumph, no shouting, no final humiliation. Instead, there was a steady undoing of the lie, that I was a burden, that my life could be dismissed. The truth had been written, signed, and then lived, a slow, everyday reclamation. My son learned to be accountable in ways he never had, and my daughter-in-law, though she still bristled sometimes, began to include me in plans rather than exclude me from them. As spring approached, the house felt different. The kitchen remodel finished under proper oversight. Friends and neighbors offered help rather than whispers. The children learned that dinner was a time to speak and listen. I relearned what it meant to belong without being consumed. The revenge I'd sought had not been carnage, it had been restoration with a backbone. They had been made to face consequences small enough to teach and large enough to last. On a warm evening some months later, the youngest grandchild curled in my lap as we watched a soccer game in the yard. He leaned over and whispered, "You're the best storyteller, Grandpa." I smiled, the kind of smile that is both soft and quietly satisfied. The boy didn't know about the months of quiet strategy, the nitty-gritty of permits and bank visits, the nights I lay awake worrying. He only knew that the man beside him listened and laughed, and fixed small things. Revenge had been a map, not a target. I'd followed the lines to a place where dignity could be rewritten, where words could no longer be carelessly thrown across a table. They still had to earn trust back, and I would watch them, ready, not to punish, but to make sure the lesson stuck. That was the final victory, to take the night they'd pushed me out and convert it into a dawn where I sat at their table on my own terms, with ink, law, and everyday acts ensuring I would never again be called what I was not. And whenever the bitterness of that first Thanksgiving threatened to rise, I would remember something my mother used to say. If you want warmth in winter, you learn to make your own fire. I'd made mine, slowly, without fireworks, and it lit the house in a way that neither humiliation nor contempt could snuff out. That was my story. Now I'd like to hear yours. Share it in the comments below.